Good morning, friends at C3. Great to be with you. Bryan Berghoef here, pastor at Holland UCC. Hope you all are doing well. We're going to talk a little bit this morning about the theme of exploration and exploration in a religious or spiritual sense. And we'll be guided by the text from Galatians chapter 6, verses 4 to 6, written by the Apostle Paul, and the translation I'm using is from the Message, Galatians 6, 4 to 6. And Paul writes, "Make a careful exploration of who you are and the work you've been given, and then sink yourself into that. Don't be impressed with yourself. Don't compare yourself with others. Each of you must take responsibility for doing the creative best you can with your own life. Be very sure now, you who have been trained to a self-sufficient maturity, that you enter into a generous common life with those who have trained you, sharing all the good things that you have and experience." Now, my family loves to take road trips. My wife Christy and I have 4 kids, and we have trekked them all over the country, as well as Canada. We've been down to the Southwest to visit some of the beautiful national parks in the desert in Utah, Arizona, New Mexico. We've been up to the Pacific Northwest and the Olympic Peninsula. We've gone to Prince Edward Island in Nova Scotia. And 5 years ago, we took what was an incredible trip up to Alaska. And we are not great at planning ahead, making detailed itineraries, or anything like that. We kind of have a general idea of where we're going and figure it out along the way. We typically camp, and so we don't even make reservations at campgrounds. We just assume we'll find something and we'll make it work. Well, this has its pluses and its minuses because it can create stressful situations when you've been on the road and can't find a place to stay. But it gives us that sense of adventure, that sense of exploration. When we don't have it all planned out, it kind of feels like, well, hey, anything could happen. And sometimes anything does. One particular moment happened on our way up to Alaska. We saw on the map that there were 2 ways to get into Alaska by car. And one was the traditional route through the Alaska Highway, the more southern route. But then we saw that you could veer off to the north of the Alaska Highway onto the Klondike Highway, and that took you up further north into Yukon. And then after heading north for quite a ways, eventually again went west and headed into Alaska via the Top of the World Highway, it was called. And this Klondike Highway was the northernmost way that you could enter Alaska by car, and it was somewhat paralleling the route used by prospectors during the gold rush of 1898, the Klondike Gold Rush. And as soon as we saw our options, my wife and I looked at each other and we thought, let's do the crazier route. Let's go as far north as we can by car, and let's do it. We hadn't planned on that. It just was kind of a spur of the moment decision. And, who cares about road conditions or the fact that we're driving a 2008 minivan packed with 4 kids and 2 adults who've been on the road for 2 weeks already? Let's just do it. So, turns out the road less traveled is also the road less cared for. And so a large part of this was unpaved, gravel road, potholes and other hazards along the way, not to mention hardly a sign of human civilization or activity for most of the way. Well, buckle up, kids. Here we go. And of course, since we hadn't planned this, didn't really know what we were getting ourselves into, we had trouble finding a place to stay. And it was summer, and we were literally heading into the land of the midnight sun. And because when you're that far north in the summer, the sun almost never, if at all, sets. And so I just kept driving. It was still light out, and man, the view was spectacular. There were blues and purples of the mountains in that late evening dusk that were just incredible ahead of us. And just kind of, we kept pushing forward, but the kids were getting sleepy, a little crabby. They started dozing off. We were looking for signs for a campground anywhere, couldn't find anything. And eventually we saw a little turnoff off the side of the road. And I just thought, let's just do this. So we pulled off into this little turnoff. It's kind of a clearing surrounded by some woods. There was maybe a 2-track that went off to who knows where. We didn't know where that road went, who owned this land, what it was, but we were tired and we were going to sleep. Now we were pulling a little camper, but the space wasn't really sufficient for us to get that thing all set up, and we were too tired anyway. So we just decided, let's just sleep in the car. Now this particular minivan we were driving was a Honda Odyssey, and on a previous road trip we had also had the occasion of sleeping in the car, and when that occasion arose, the van was lovingly dubbed Hotel Odyssey. So this was a Hotel Odyssey kind of night. Now, sleeping in the car, of course, is always difficult, even in the best of circumstances. But when you're in the middle of God knows where, you're in grizzly bear and moose country, and you don't know if there's another human being around for hundreds of miles, well, turns out sleep is even harder. And so I slept with one hand on our can of bear spray, and none of us really slept that well at all. So, a little before 6 a.m., it's kind of like, well, this is it. Let's hit the road. Let's bust open a box of Pop-Tarts and keep going. Well, we're finally nearing the last city in Canada, the last city in Yukon before you hit Alaska, Dawson City. And gravel road, and a semi rumbled past us in this early morning hours, kicking up pebbles and stones off our van and so on. Not great. Then a little hatchback, a little 2-door car comes down the road the other way, kicks a stone off of our camper, ricochets off our camper into our back windshield, which shattered, completely shattered, blew out. We all started screaming. Our 2 youngest kids were in the back seat of the van. They started screaming. We pulled over, took a look at it, and it was a mess, totally blown out, a few shards still sort of hanging on. Great. And it was just starting to drizzle a little bit, just starting to rain a little. Perfect, right? Well, we limped into Dawson City around 7 a.m., and to our great surprise, one of the first things we saw as we again find a little civilization was an auto parts store. Thank you, God. So it wasn't open yet because it was only 7. We sat around for an hour or so until it opened. Doors opened. Our bedraggled crew kind of rushed in, and I breathlessly explained to the gentleman behind the counter our predicament. And he said, "No problem, I'll help you fix that." I thought, great. A brand new windshield. Perfect. Couldn't be better luck. But then he started setting some supplies on the counter. A few rolls of duct tape, some gloves, some cardboard, some pliers, and I began to understand what he meant by fix. Well, so we went out to the van and put gloves on. With the pliers in our hands, we tore out the remaining shards of glass till it was clean. The back windshield was just empty, nothing there. Then we set up the cardboard and unrolled the rolls of duct tape and just made strips all the way across, just taping this cardboard to the window, and we kind of layered it like shingles so that rain couldn't get in. And before you know it, our whole back windshield was covered up with duct tape, and it was watertight. And there you have it. That was our new windshield. And our guy said, "That'll get you through your trip," he said proudly. We said, "Thank you very much." And it turned out he was right. And so for the rest of our trip, right, we couldn't see out the back window, but of course it was most important that we could see out the front windshield because further adventures awaited. And frankly, looking back, I think because we went off the map, so to speak, because we hadn't planned ahead, because we took a risk and explored, we had an adventure that remained a highlight of that trip. To this day, our kids still talk about the chaos of that late night, sleeping in the van, the explosion of the windshield, the craziness of duct taping that thing, and then limping in our taped together Honda Odyssey over the top of the World Highway into Alaska, where even more crazy and exciting adventures awaited. It was an experience that we'll never forget, and I wonder how this relates to our spiritual journeys. My own experience in the church was that a serious journey of any sort was discouraged. After all, there was no new ground to discover. Everything about God and the life of faith had been charted out long before. Our job, we were told, was to study the map, not to actually go anywhere. The books and the creeds and confessions had already been written. It was simply up to us to read, and I hate to say it, regurgitate them. I wonder if you can relate to this experience. Well, the Hindu mystic Anthony de Mello tells the story, I should say Indian, he was actually a Christian. Anthony de Mello tells the story of the explorer who returned to his people, and they were eager to know about the Amazon. So this explorer had gone off, explored the Amazon River, came back. They said, "Tell us all about it." But how could he ever put into words the feelings that flooded his heart when he saw the exotic flowers, and when he heard the night sounds of the forests, when he sensed the danger of wild beasts, or paddled his canoe over treacherous rapids? He said, "Go and find out for yourselves." Well, to guide them, he drew them a map of the river. Well, they pounced upon the map. They framed it in their town hall. They made copies of it for themselves, and all who had a copy considered themselves experts on the river. For did they not know its every turn and bend, how broad it was, how deep, where the rapids were, and where the falls? De Mello, after telling this story, notes that the Buddha steadfastly refused to be drawn into talking about God. He was obviously familiar with the danger of armchair explorers. In fact, one of the Buddha's most famous teachings, perhaps you've heard it, has to do with the teachings of the parable of the raft. And in it, he likened his own teachings to a raft that helps one cross a river. And so the story goes that a man is trapped on one side of the river. And on this side of the river, the side he is on, there's great danger, peril, and fear. And on the other side of the river is safety and security. Well, there's no bridge crossing this river. There's no ferry to get you across. And so the man has to figure something out. So he gathers logs and leaves and branches and vines and ends up crafting a sort of raft. And using his hands and his feet as paddles, he makes his way across the river safely to the other side. The Buddha then asks his listeners the question, what would you think if the man, having crossed over the river, thought to himself, "This raft has served me well, so I will carry it on my back over the land now"? Well, his listeners thought that wasn't a great idea, and the Buddha agreed, saying, "So it is with my teachings, which are like a raft and are for crossing over with, not for ceasing hold of." Well, many of us in our early religious life, perhaps especially here in West Michigan, are taught the opposite, right? We must learn the old answers to questions that have already been asked, right? No questions are really invited from us. We must learn those old answers and carry them around with us, even if they no longer make sense or apply to our lives. But here's the thing, life is a journey, especially the spiritual life. God or the divine is a deep mystery which no one person or faith tradition can fully capture. How much better if we treated ancient scriptures and teachings and writings as signposts along the way instead of confusing them for the destination itself. The philosopher and theologian John Caputo ponders the nature of a journey. He says, if you knew very well where you were going from the start and had the means to get there, it would almost be like getting there before you even set out, or like ending up where you were all along. You might be right, frankly. If it's all charted territory and there is no discovery, is it actually a journey? Or are we willing to traverse places where there are bends in the road around which we cannot yet see? It seems to me that this is the essence of what faith is all about. Faith is what led Moses to lead the people through the desert along paths that didn't always go straight. Faith is what led Jacob to wrestle with God before the dawn. Faith is what led Abraham to leave family and familiarity behind to head off into new, uncharted territory. If the path is already lit, if there are no moments of darkness, if the map has already been drawn, then what need would there be for faith? True faith, at its core, is radical trust. So if there's no element of risk, no venturing into the unknown, then perhaps our spiritual journeys have never left home. Caputo goes on to say, going to a place we already know how to reach, or going with a tour guide who has mapped every stop along the way, or along a paved road with guardrails, rest stops and food stands where everyone speaks English, that's hardly a journey at all. So my encouragement to you is this: be an explorer. Be an explorer. Step off the beaten and familiar religious trail. Don't be afraid to read the Sufi mystics, the Jewish sages, or the Buddhist lamas. Read the scriptures of the great world religious traditions, especially ones different from your own or different from the ones you were raised in. Study philosophers and ethicists, and by all means, of course, get out and physically travel if you're able. And travel the road of doubt and deconstruction. Ask the hard questions and then ask some more. Turn everything you've ever been taught about God, Jesus, humanity, inside out and upside down. It's a big world out there, and we must presume that the mysteries of religion and faith are even bigger. Now, the text in Galatians invites us to what it calls a self-sufficient maturity. In other words, when we explore ourselves in the depths of the divine, we grow and we mature. It also says, enter into a generous common life with those who have trained you, sharing all the good things that you have and experience. In other words, don't hold it against the folks who taught you what they did when you were just starting out on the journey. Those whose views have never changed, those who are perhaps still clinging tightly to the map. Don't write off folks who feel that any journey off the straight and narrow is ill-advised and maybe even dangerous. Don't write them off, because those folks now need what you have to offer. But of course, such invitations must be offered gently and humbly. And of course, remember that at an earlier stage of the journey, you needed them, and they were there for you. And the truth is, we all have to start somewhere. And so as children, we are handed teachings, stories, and beliefs, and these are good and useful and have their place. And in the early stages of life and faith, we actually need them. But too often we seize onto them like the raft in the story, feeling like we've crossed the only river that exists, and now we're content to stay on the familiar shore, build a dwelling, put a frame of the map on the wall, and not go anywhere else spiritually. But the truth is, that's only the beginning. So let's chop up the raft and make a fire that can warm us through the night. But in the morning, it's time to hit the road. Exploration, adventure, and new territory awaits. Amen and namaste. Thank you, friends. Hope to see you out on the road.